Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 13th Annual Human Trafficking Symposium and our very first virtual event of this kind. My name is Julie Beller, and I'm the chair for the board of directors of this amazing community-based task force. We are extremely grateful to be able to put on this event in such a crazy year. There were some days early on in this pandemic and the usual time we begin our planning for this event when I thought we would not be able to hold our symposium. It would have been the first time in our history not to host this important event for our community. As we start our first segment for today, we want to recognize what a crazy year 2020 has been. It has been a year of tremendous upheaval in our country and around the world. No one has been unaffected by the COVID-19 pandemic, extreme economic changes and challenges that have come along with that, and the civil turmoil that we see in the news every day. But as allies in the anti-trafficking movement specifically, we recognize that victims of human trafficking were already struggling and highly vulnerable to economic instability, as well as other things. And there are unique challenges that survivors of human trafficking face. Now we add on top of that the fallout of a global pandemic. There is a need for us to fully understand the impact that current events, and especially the COVID-19 pandemic, are having on those directly affected by human trafficking. We know that traffickers and sex buyers easily adapt to changing conditions. And we need to know as well how to change our ways of combating trafficking and supporting people who want to exit a life in the sex trade. This brings me to our first speaker. I am honored to introduce Megan Lundstrom, who is co-founder and executive director of the Avery Center for Research and Services, formerly known as Free Our Girls. Not only is Megan a national public speaker on the issue of commercial sexual exploitation, she is an internationally published researcher. She holds a BS in finance and an MA in sociology from the University of Northern Colorado. The Avery Center is using research to reduce demand, convict traffickers, and decrease barriers for marginalized populations through evidence-based services. Megan has researched how the COVID-19 pandemic has affected sex trafficking. Her research appears in an article by Dr. Melissa Farley called Prostitution, the Sex Trade, and the COVID-19 Pandemic. Megan, thank you for giving us your time today, sharing with us what you have learned and found in your research. Welcome.
Hello and good morning. Today, I am going to be sharing a little bit about the research and work that the Avery Center has been doing over 2020 and talking a little bit about what we have seen around the COVID-19 pandemic and how it has been impacting the commercial sex trade. So to get started, this is kind of what we're going to be talking about today. So we're going to take a look at commercial sex buyers and how the pandemic has impacted them, what we've seen from traffickers, and then finally, what victims and survivors have been experiencing. So to define a buyer, for the purpose of this presentation, I really want to stress that when a buyer purchases sex from somebody who is under the age of 18, or when a buyer uses forced fraud or coercion to get that sex act, they can also be a trafficker. So there's this intersection between these two terms and two populations. But broadly speaking, a sex buyer is the individual that has something of value that they exchange for a commercial sex act. And so when we're looking at buyers and what their behavior and thoughts and any changes that have happened over this year, we look at a couple different places. First of all, we look at online discussion and review forums. And since FOSTA-SESTA was passed, many of these online review and discussion forums have been shut down, or they're now hosted overseas and aren't accessible here in the US. But one of the remaining review forums here in the United States is actually here in Colorado. And a majority of the sex buyers that participate in this publicly accessible forum are Colorado residents. And so that gives us a really unique look into what's happening nationally, but also really specifically what's happening here in Colorado. So you may ask, why does this forum still exist in Colorado? Well, simply put, it's because Colorado does not have a prostitution, promotion of prostitution statute. And so what they are doing on this forum, talking about commercial sex acts and encouraging one another to engage in commercial sex acts, is actually not illegal. So that's one place that we look. Another place that we look is the Avery Center collaborates with law enforcement agencies to do demand reduction operations. And we also help facilitate what we refer to as First Offender Restoration Initiative. And so that is for men who are arrested for attempting to purchase sex, and it's their first offense. So it may not be their actual first time purchasing sex, but it is their first time being arrested for it. So those are all of the places that we really have these touch points with what's happening with commercial sex buyers. So several themes have emerged over this year so far with regards to how the pandemic has impacted or not impacted sex buying behavior. So the first theme is that there's really been minimal concern about spreading or contracting COVID-19. So this quote came from one of the buyer discussion boards. And as you can see, he is what we consider a high frequency buyer. He pays for sex transactions quite frequently. And he's not that worried. He's going to continue to get COVID tests at intervals he deems appropriate, but it won't be impacting his behavior. So we did see a lot of this conversation and hear this feedback from sex buyers over this year. The second theme that has emerged over this year, and it was really apparent at the beginning of the pandemic when shelter orders were in place across the country. And so we saw this artificial suppression of demand due to these shelter orders. Now, this artificial suppression really impacted major metropolitan areas, so really big cities. Here in Colorado, we really didn't see this a significant decrease in demand. There was absolutely a drop because people's movements were restricted. However, it was not as significant as big cities across the country. And in smaller, more rural communities, like where the Avery Center is situated, we really didn't see a reduction in demand whatsoever. And so this quote here just kind of acknowledges the fact that, yes, there's been a suppression in demand due to these external forces, but that it won't last because it's ultimately not changing the buyer's behavior or attitudes or values or beliefs around why they purchase sex. So the next theme that emerged was this transition to virtual markets, and therefore kind of this global accessibility sex buyers now have. So traditionally, sex buyers have access to their immediate geographic location. And so what we saw was, and Pornhub even was very proud of this. They announced it at the beginning of the pandemic, was a huge increase in downloads and viewing and traffic to the Pornhub website. We also saw this website called OnlyFans really take off. And so OnlyFans is used by a lot of different people outside of the commercial sex trade. But within the commercial sex trade, we saw this mass migration of victims and prostituted persons to this platform to sell photos and videos and like video call chats and messaging services. So sex buyers can subscribe to different prostituted persons' profiles and engage virtually in these transactions. So this has been a really fascinating dynamic sociologically to look at. And even within kind of the buyer forums, it's been a toss-up. So a lot of buyers just insisting that this is what they have to do to have this need for commercial sex met at this time. But we've also heard a lot of buyers say that this is not the fix for them because they really want in-person interactions. So the next theme that we saw, particularly at the beginning of COVID, but we're really continuing to see these conversations in the forums, is a lack of understanding and care about marginalized populations that the sex trade is overwhelmingly comprised of. And so this buyer just talks about, like some prostituted people may exit the commercial sex trade due to the pandemic and their income being impacted by it. But at the same time, an entirely new vulnerable population may find themselves pushed into engaging in commercial sex out of a lack of other options due to unemployment. And then finally, this theme, looking really local at demand, law enforcement has not been able to do demand reduction operations in the same frequency that they had prior to COVID for many different reasons. And so one of the local law enforcement agencies that we collaborate and consult with had a demand reduction operation just a couple weeks ago. And so checking in with them after that operation to see how it went. One of the officers that we have a great relationship with shared how shockingly high the demand was. So when they posted advertisements on some of the websites that are used up here in Northern Colorado, they really weren't sure what to expect. They weren't sure if buyers even were engaging in in-person transactions or if everybody was just doing virtual transactions. They just weren't sure. And unfortunately, the demand was super high, so equal or if not higher than what it was pre-pandemic. So let's shift now to talking about traffickers and what we have seen with traffickers over this year and how they've responded to the pandemic. So traffickers, when I use that term, it is to define somebody who uses force, fraud, or coercion to manipulate somebody into engaging in commercial sex acts. So like I mentioned with buyers, there's an overlap in these two populations sometimes. There may not be a third-party trafficker. It is the person that is receiving the commercial sex act that is the trafficker and the buyer at the same time. However, a trafficker can also be a third party who is arranging or forcing these transactions to happen between the prostituted person and the buyer. So we saw three main themes with traffickers over this year. And you may be asking, how do we know this about traffickers? Well, we have identified over 600 traffickers on social media across the United States primarily, but also that network is kind of spreading across the world right now. So it's been an interesting network analysis that we're working on. So we have just this very narrow glimpse into what we're seeing. And so I absolutely want to acknowledge that the traffickers that we have access to on social media are pimp and gang control tactic traffickers. And this can look visually very different from familial trafficking. Unfortunately, we don't have access to a network like the one that we have with pimp and gang traffickers that are familial traffickers. So familial traffickers we're not able to observe in the same way, and I want to fully acknowledge that we don't know as clearly. We can hypothesize quite a bit about what is probably happening within familial trafficking situations. But for the purpose of what we have seen here, it's going to be that pimp and gang focus. So the first theme that we observed with traffickers across the US was just initially this general downplaying of the serious nature of the pandemic. So a lot of posts and information saying that it was a hoax, that it really wasn't as deadly as it is. And even if we had to go through these shelter orders, a lot of traffickers continue to kind of put forward this confident front that it would all be over soon and we'd be able to get back to business as usual. So that was the first theme that we saw. The second theme that we saw was this diversification of income. And most pimp and gang traffickers have multiple revenue streams. So they may engage in drug and weapons trafficking in addition to human trafficking. And they may also have a legitimate business that they launder money through, or that they are building with the proceeds of their illegal profits. So during the shelter order and the following months, we really started to see traffickers talking more about these other revenue streams. So kind of like we knew that it was happening. It was apparent that there were other revenue streams. They were really specifically reaching out through their existing established networks, particularly online, to market those other revenue sources. So we saw this with advertising specific illicit substances for sale and availability to deliver them. And then we saw traffickers moving into legitimate businesses or selling products, primarily retail products like clothing. And so that's the second theme that we saw. The third theme that we saw with traffickers is just how they use social media during this economic and health crisis. And so traffickers used hashtags like hashtag quarantine or hashtag COVID-19 or hashtag pandemic in combination with specific pimp and gang controlled trafficking hashtags that are common within that culture and community. And so if you think about like, okay, so what's the purpose of this? So what happens is if a trafficker posts that he or she has products for sale, or that they are living in an economically stable environment, their business operations have not been impacted, and they use a hashtag like quarantine, but they also use these trafficking hashtags. Somebody who may be just curious on the internet to see like what's happening under the hashtag quarantine, what are other people across the country experiencing? Well, that trafficker's post is going to come up in that. And this is a very simple and very common way that traffickers use social media to recruit vulnerable populations. So really important to acknowledge that they're using the same hashtags that we all are, for the purpose of showing that they have the solution right now that all of us are seeking answers to. Okay, so let's move on to victims and survivors. Now, when I use the term victim, I am referring to somebody who is currently experiencing commercial sexual exploitation and sex trafficking. When I use the term survivor, I'm referring to an individual who self-identifies as completely exited or escaped from their situation of exploitation. And we, again, have a national network of actively exploited individuals, and then the Avery Center is a part of the survivor community. And so we are plugged in there too, and listening and contributing and participating in conversations there around how the pandemic has impacted us as individuals, and at that personal level with our families, and also at that professional level with organizations and our work in and out of the anti-trafficking movement. So the first piece that we really observed at the very beginning of the pandemic, and I've not seen much change, is what happened when shelter orders went into place. So where did victims go? And overwhelmingly, we saw victims moving home or staying home, staying with friends and family, or kind of just huddled down in a hotel if they were experiencing homelessness. A really big theme that we saw was a lot of victims basically connecting for the first time, at least on social media, with children. And so that was something that was very shocking because there were a lot of photos of family time during the shelter order that I didn't necessarily know some of these individuals had these social supports and these families of origin that they were connected to, because that was not content that they typically share on their pages. So we also saw individuals working on going back to school, starting other sources of income, supplementing their income with doing like food delivery and rideshare, selling products or creating a business at home in their downtime. But overwhelmingly, these themes we saw happening for white and cisgendered women. When we really started looking at the race and gender intersections of what was happening during the shelter order, it became obvious very quickly that the experiences of women of color and trans women were vastly different than these themes. So what we saw there was an increase in street prostitution, an increase in online escort services, and again, moving on to this OnlyFans platform, we saw commercial sex acts occurring from their personal residences. And then we also saw this significant social isolation. So really not as much family and social supports in place for these individuals to go back to safely shelter in place. So I think this is a really important distinction to recognize. Even folks in the commercial sex trade are not having the same experiences as one another. And it becomes very obvious when you look at the intersections of race and gender. For survivors, so those of us who have successfully exited and escaped commercial sexual exploitation, we really saw food and safety insecurities. A lot of survivors are in entry level and therefore essential worker positions. So while there was job layoffs and furloughs that happened, or total work hours per week were reduced, we really saw a lot of survivors still were employed, but they were employed in high risk positions. General economic instability, and crisis, so lack of savings accounts due to continuing to live in poverty and just not having the ability to put money aside. Significant social isolation and the impact on mental health that has had, and then this disconnection from vital services. So particularly during the shelter order and as agencies, nonprofits, mental health services, healthcare facilities were figuring out telehealth and how to remain in contact with patients and clients. We just saw this, this great void that happened of there were a ton of supports and then there was nothing. So because we saw all of this within the survivor community, we actually put out a survey, I believe it was like in April of this year, to kind of get a feel for, were there differences between what survivors have been experiencing compared with allies, so individuals that do not hold lived experience with sex trafficking and commercial sexual exploitation. So we sent out this survey, we had a great response rate, and really the feedback and results from that survey were just alarming at how different survivors have been impacted by the pandemic when compared with allies that are connected with the Avery Center. So these are kind of the high-level overview of how survivors and allies have experienced the pandemic, at least those first couple of months. So the entire survey population was overwhelmingly white and cisgendered. However, 20% of the survivor respondents were Black, Indigenous, and persons of color, and also a higher rate of LGBTQ folks. And so looking at that compared with allies, we know that trafficking broadly disproportionately impacts marginalized populations. And so we did see some of that same representation within our sample. Within the survivors that responded to the survey, 2 of them disclosed they had already had positive COVID tests. And at that point in time, no allies that had responded had a positive COVID test, or really most of them didn't know of anybody who had had a positive COVID test yet. Survivors had a higher rate of reduced hours or being laid off. The big difference here between survivors and allies was that survivors, this being laid off or having reduced hours, put them in severe economic distress, compared with allies who were laid off or furloughed, but maybe had a partner who was still able to maintain their standard level of employment, or they had savings accounts or other resources that they could kind of fall back on in the meantime, so that there was not this urgent need to look for a job. And then finally, survivors were twice as likely as allies to be employed in high-risk essential worker jobs. So again, higher rates of exposure to COVID-19 and higher likelihood of contracting COVID-19 for this population. So this survey, I want to share just some of these really big contrasting experiences with you all to just drive home this point. So similar to victims currently experiencing exploitation and that intersection of race and gender, highlighting that not everyone in the commercial sex trade is having the same experience right now. Similarly, survivors and allies are not having the same experience right now. So when we asked survivors and allies kind of like what has been the biggest change for you so far, survivors really highlighted just complete social isolation, and allies acknowledged that they were not able to go out and move about in public the way that they had before. However, they had adult children and maybe school-age children that were all back in the home together. Partners and spouses were living and working in the same environment. And so they had more connection with their family of choice or family of origin than they had previously. So this is one of many reasons why I encourage people to use the term physical distancing and not social distancing. Social distancing has been tremendously damaging for survivors. So many of us struggle with trust and relationships and navigating healthy relationships, and rebuilding or finding relationships that are safe and healthy and supportive. And so when the pandemic hit, all of us experienced this social isolation and social distancing. So that's always one of my tips is consider using the term physical distancing, because we are trying to physically distance ourselves from one another, but the social isolation and social impact has been very significant for vulnerable populations. And we need to make sure that folks know that we are still present and we're still showing up, and relationships still matter, even though we maybe physically cannot be close to one another. So we also asked what is one thing that you are starting to understand or has been something that you're working on during the pandemic. And survivors really shared this theme of needing to access basic needs and tangible services, and recognizing how to navigate systems that were still open and accessible, so that these basic needs and tangible supports were something that they could get. When compared with allies, we really saw this just a different, again, totally different experience. So this ability to just pause life and enjoy time with family. So not as many worries about economic instability, at least at the beginning of the pandemic. And then finally, when we asked survivors and allies, what do you need most right now? Again, we had this vastly different response from survivors compared with allies. Survivors really stressed the need for social connection, tangible resources, a return to some kind of normalcy. So being able to see friends and family again, being able to connect with support systems in person, being able to access services and resources in the community that maybe were closed or they weren't able to get to. When we looked at allies' responses to this question, what do you need? Really their themes were around kind of just being very thankful to be healthy, to be with family, and to be economically stable, that they knew that they could weather this, at least at the beginning of the pandemic, this kind of temporary, we don't know what's happening, but we will figure it out and we're going to get through it okay. So an additional study that we did over the COVID-19 pandemic was looking at individuals who were both currently in the commercial sex trade and individuals who identified as completely and successfully exited. And I just want to highlight a couple of things that we saw here because the pandemic creates this both and space. So individuals who were currently in the commercial sex trade found themselves faced with this decision of, I need to figure out other revenue streams. I've maybe been physically distanced from my trafficker and reconnected with my family of choice or family of origin and can access resources. And so we did see this opportunity to exit during the pandemic. We also saw individuals who had successfully exited experiencing psychological or economic triggers or social triggers that pushed them back into engaging in survival sex to make ends meet. And then thirdly, we also saw vulnerable individuals who did not previously have exposure to the commercial sex trade, but entering the commercial sex trade out of a lack of other economic options. So just as one story that I would love to share, and these kinds of stories this is why my job, I love my job. I love being where I'm at in this work and getting to have these connections. I had the privilege a couple weeks ago of traveling to Dallas, Texas to do a training for some guys that are working on some demand reduction tactics down in Texas. And I posted this picture on my social media network where we're connected with over 1,900 actively exploited individuals. And at about 3 o'clock in the morning, so I posted this at I think 8 o'clock in the morning. So 3 o'clock in the morning, the next morning, I got a message from a woman who I had not, was a part of the network, but I had not gotten to connect with kind of on a one-on-one basis. And she messaged me and said, "Are you still in Dallas?" And so we continued. Once I woke up, I was not awake at 3 a.m. Once I woke up that day, I just engaged in conversation with her, got to know. She was visiting from another state. She had come out to Texas. She had been out of the life for a significant period of time, and the economic vulnerabilities that the pandemic had caused in her life had created this situation where she felt like she had no choice but to return to the commercial sex trade. And while in Dallas, she was moving through those stages of change and thinking about, is this really what she wants to do? And are there other options? And it was such an honor to get to talk to her and to build a little teeny bit of trust that she would let me in and share those vulnerabilities with me, who I'm a complete stranger to her. And so over that day, got to know her. We were able to connect her with a survivor-led organization in her community and talk through some support resources that were potentially available to her there that could help. with her economic situation so that she did not feel like she was pushed back into the commercial sex trade against her will and out of just desperate economic survival. And at the end of that conversation, she said, thank you for this. I'm really thankful. And being out here has really made me think about if this is really what the solution is, or if I need to just keep trying and reach out to some more supports in her community. And so that's just a perfect example of these stages of change and the realities of the commercial sex trade and some of these movements into the commercial sex trade and out of the commercial sex trade that we've been observing over 2020. So let's wrap this kind of back up and go full circle. Is COVID changing the commercial sex trade? So this is a little bit more complicated question. Like, I wish I could give a one-word answer. So yes, COVID has changed a lot in terms of where demand is accessing vulnerable populations. It is changing the mental health impact and access to resources that exploited and vulnerable people can access at any time. It's decreased artificially in-person demand, at least in some communities. It's impacted the revenue of victims, which may prompt them to, their traffickers to abandon them and them to be able to return home, but it may also prompt punishment from the traffickers. It's decreased connection to others. It's decreased any savings and reserve funds that vulnerable individuals may have had to begin with. So it's changed all these things at this micro level, absolutely. It's changing the landscape of things. But at that macro, the big picture level, is COVID-19 changing the commercial sex trade? Well, the commercial sexual exploitation happens at the intersection of gender-based violence, poverty, and racism. And until we eliminate gender-based violence, poverty, and racism, we are going to continue to see commercial sexual exploitation. And so when we look at over 2020, we haven't eliminated gender-based violence and poverty and racism. If nothing else, the pandemic has really highlighted how much of these huge issues are alive and thriving and how many people are impacted by each of them. So yes, the pandemic has impacted people at an individual level and has shifted where the commercial sex trade is showing up visually and physically. But ultimately, it has not impacted the fact that there is still demand for commercial sex. It has not shifted our culture, and it has not shifted traffickers or sex buyers' beliefs about why they engage in the activities that they engage in. So the next question then, it's shifted some things in terms of how we connect with people, where vulnerabilities might show up, how people have access to resources, but it hasn't changed these macros. The next question should be, is COVID changing how we respond to trafficking? Well, it should, because a lot at that micro level has changed. So what I can tell you about the Avery Center and what we have been working on this year is, first and foremost, we went through this name change from Free Our Girls to the Avery Center. And one of our big deciding factors on that was recognizing that we serve all ages and all genders. And we really want to make sure that any individual who is in need of our services knows that we are here to walk with them in their journey. Additionally, we've seen food and safety insecurity for SNAP benefit recipients. So I love being able to have my groceries delivered to my door. The reality is that SNAP benefit recipients are not necessarily always able to have that same access to safe food and hygiene and cleaning products. Because a lot of these order and delivery services do not accept SNAP payments. So we have been working to make sure that our most vulnerable clients who have had to self-isolate due to really serious health conditions have still been able to maintain access to these basic needs. We have moved all of our programs 100% virtually accessible. So I'm so proud of the Avery Center's team because this crew, you guys, let me tell you, they buckled down and made it happen this year to make sure that there was not a disruption in services. As a result of moving everything online, while we have always networked and connected and done outreach nationally, having all of our services available online has meant that they are accessible to so many more people, which is so exciting. So just as one example, we've been able to double the size of our job training program. And so now we have 4 local participant positions and 4 remote participant positions. So at a time where people are experiencing economic instability, particularly survivors, we've been able to bring on 4 additional job program participants with living wage employment from the safety of their home. So all of these things are just some of the examples of what the Avery Center has been working on to make sure that our services are still accessible. Next steps for us, we will be working on building out our digital outreach efforts. Again, it's something we've always done, but recognizing that we really need to dig in and be intentional because this is such a critical component to making sure people who need or qualify for our services know that they're available. So in closing, I want to encourage all of you be thinking about how you can change how you are responding. So whether you are an individual, a community member, a volunteer for an organization, or you maybe run an agency or provide services, be thinking about ways that you can advocate. So talking about and talking to companies who provide grocery deliveries and making sure that they advocate for them to accept SNAP benefits to pay for the groceries. If you provide resources for gaps in needs, making sure that folks who have SNAP benefits and order groceries online also have the additional funds not covered by SNAP to pay those delivery fees or have those delivery fees waived. Oops, I'm going to drag this down. We need to be focused so heavily on decreasing barriers to services and resources right now. Another great example is we have an amazing couple of funders who stepped up during COVID and made sure that our staff and our clients had access to technology, that we were able to assist with increases in utility costs and Wi-Fi, so that people could access services and work safely from home. Sustainability. Direct service agencies need your help now more than ever. The nonprofit sector is experiencing very significant economic instability right now, particularly survivor-led organizations. And so if you are already working with or supporting an organization, connect with their executive leadership and find out what they are really needing right now. And keep in mind that survivors, even when we are in positions of leadership, historically have less access to the same supports that non-survivor-led organizations have. Think about scaling. How do we scale our programs? And acknowledging COVID's not going anywhere anytime soon. And even if we find some solutions that allow businesses to open in full and allow people to move around the community more freely, there's going to be a lot of things that will be permanently changed in terms of virtual access. And so thinking through how do we make services as accessible as possible, making sure folks know about the resources and have the tools and skills and support to access them consistently. So these are some of the ways that you all can support responding to the pandemic. And we're adapting. We're human. We don't always get it right, but we are resilient, and together we are going to continue to respond to trafficking despite and because of the global pandemic that we are all living through. So thank you all so much. It has been an honor to present to you all, and I look forward to answering your questions soon.
Great. Thank you, Megan, so much for the time that you put into your presentation and for sharing with us about the research that you've done and for being with us here live this morning. I know you were active on YouTube answering questions. I know that for me personally, with all of the crazy stuff that has happened and the wild reports that float around social media, I want to make sure that we are listening to people who really do research and look at things with a critical eye. And we want to seek to put out good information. So thanks again, Megan, for sharing what you found with us and offering us some really tangible ways that people can help. Jane Jones is here with us as well, and she has been collecting some questions from the chat so that they can be asked here live. Jane?
Thanks. Megan, thank you so much. That was absolutely amazing. We always appreciate everything that you do and help us out with symposiums. So we did have a question in the chat that you had let Suze Hess know that you were going to be answering in the live chat. And so just for our audience to know, the question was, you indicated that this survey was done in April. Now that the pandemic continues, do you have plans to do another survey?
Yes, so we recognize really the critical importance of knowing what's happening and kind of having our pulse on changes as they're happening. And so we have two research funding requests that we just submitted that we're looking at doing a really much larger scale survey and interview process with victims and survivors across the United States. So as soon as we hear back, send us good vibes that we get that funding so that we can get those answers to our community.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. I have a couple other questions too. Are there any efforts to enact a promotion of prostitution statute in Colorado?
Yes, I'm glad you picked up on that. That's like my thing right now that I'm ranting against. So we had actually started the conversation with some politicians and stakeholders here in Northern Colorado, like January, February of this year, and then the pandemic hit and just legislative session and all of that kind of went out the window, obviously, with shelter orders and just reduced in-person activities. So I would love to see that statute get added here in Colorado, and I think we're going to need a lot of stakeholders on board to make that happen.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Here's another question. Do you think that we will see a permanent increase in interest in the virtual markets by buyers? You know, not only just the buying of sex, but also pornography.
Sure. I am so fascinated by what's happening in the virtual market right now. And I do think that we're probably going to see this shift doesn't just go away when physical distancing restrictions are lifted. I think it has given just this it's created a global market. And it's, again, like I'd love to continue doing research on it because law enforcement, financial institutions, everybody is kind of at this place of like, what is happening and how do we address this?
Right. Excellent. I think a lot of us feel the same way. I don't think much of what's been going on is really going to end anytime soon. So thank you for that. So we have time for one more question. What do you see as the most important thing that allies can do for survivors in this continuing season of hardship?
Oh man, I have to just pick one thing.
Well, you can pick one.
Geez. I think if you know and walk alongside survivors in whatever capacity, check in on us. It's been a really rough, triggering, exhausting year, and not just the pandemic. So we have protests, we have political season. It's a lot. It's really overwhelming. And for those of us that are in positions of leadership, realizing people are looking to us for answers, and we're like, I don't know. Like, we don't have a playbook for this. Like, I don't know either. So check in. I have an ally, Dr. Angie Henderson, that I work with, and she's really been just a source of sanity for me over this year, and has really gone out of her way to make sure that I am not just completely circling the drain. And really appreciate that friendship and encouragement and support to make sure I'm hanging out with people in virtual context, that I'm not just completely gone. So I think that would be my suggestion. Little tiny efforts and demonstrations of support just really go a long way right now.
Absolutely love it. Thank you, Megan. Julie?
Yeah, Megan, thanks so much for sharing all of that with us. You guys, Megan and the Avery Center for Research is very active on social media. I always highly suggest, when something goes on in the news, people start emailing me all kinds of questions, and is this real? Is this true? And I'm like, I don't know, let's go check out what Megan and Bridge Hope and all these other people are saying, because they look at it from a different perspective than I do. And I truly appreciate and trust the information that they put out. I do know, Megan, that you do little care packages on a regular basis for people around the nation. So I believe it was yesterday you posted some of those things. So if you're interested in helping fill some of those needs, reach out to Megan and just find out what you can do, very tangible things that you can do to support the Avery Center and survivors across the nation. Our next and final session for today is going to address something that we as a community have not talked much about yet, but is something that we need to bring into the conversation when we talk about ending sex trafficking and the commercial sexual exploitation of individuals in our community and around the world. I was introduced to the work of Peter Qualliotine about 3 years ago, following several conversations I had with people in our community on how to effectively address the demand for purchased sex. My questions led me on Google searches, researching programs, and wondering, how do we engage people who buy sex, often called Johns, but who are truly perpetrators of a crime? My hope is that today is the beginning of a larger conversation for those of us involved in the anti-trafficking movement here. This conversation will be complex. We have to look at our society, our norms, our culture, and the whys of what drives people to believe that it's okay to purchase another human being's body for our sexual pleasure and emotional release. I am truly pleased to be able to introduce you to Peter Qualliotine. He has been working to promote men's accountability and the end of commercial sexual exploitation and other forms of gender-based violence for more than 30 years. In the early 1990s, he co-founded the Sexual Exploitation Education Project in Portland, Oregon, where he created one of the first sex buyers intervention programs in the country. During that time, he also worked with the Portland Women's Crisis Line to integrate the issue of commercial sexual exploitation into a comprehensive middle and high school program to prevent gender-based violence. In 2012, he co-founded the Organization for Prostitution Survivors, known as OPS, with Noel Gomez in Seattle. As Director of Men's Accountability, he launched a 10-week sex buyers intervention program called Stopping Sexual Exploitation, and he co-coordinated the King County Ending Exploitation Collaborative. He currently lives in Western Massachusetts and coordinates a program called Modeling Equality, which he'll share with us today. This is a project to catalyze the creation and implementation of policies and practices across multiple sectors that address commercial sexual exploitation through an equality model framework. I'm thrilled to have Peter here with us to share his knowledge and experience. Our challenge will be Colorado Springs. What are we going to do with this information? Peter, thank you for being here with us. We're excited to hear what you have for us this morning.
Great. Thank you so much, Julie. It's really a pleasure to be with you this morning, and thank you for your interest in addressing the issue of commercial sexual exploitation through the lens of gender-based violence and inequality. I think it's not a common way to look at the issue, but an essential one, an absolutely essential one. And so again, I'm Peter Qualliotine, and your introduction makes me feel kind of old, but I've been doing this work a long time, for about 30 years. And presently I'm coordinating Modeling Equality, which is a project to promote policies and practices that are consistent with an equality model framework of how we understand the issue of commercial sexual exploitation. And that is a real mouthful. And so we'll unpack that throughout the course of my presentation with you this morning. But it's a relatively new effort. Modeling Equality has only been around for a year and a half. But as Julie said, I've been actively working on the issue of commercial sexual exploitation for over 30 years. I got my start not even knowing that this is what I was going to end up doing. I got my start working on issues of domestic violence and what men could do to stop it. And I was interested in working on domestic violence and what men can do to stop it because I grew up in a domestic violence household. And I recognized pretty early on that although my father's violence became a problem for my mother and my siblings and myself, that it was really his problem. His inability to deal with frustration, anxiety, disappointment, criticism, and his feelings of entitlement to take it out sideways on the people around him, on the people who loved him, and on the people who he loved. And it wasn't until I got a little older and started recognizing that it wasn't happening just in my house, but it was happening in lots of houses. And where it was happening, it was primarily a form of men's violence against women, a form of gender-based violence. As I got older, still things happened, like my sister came to me and told me she'd been sexually assaulted. Other female and male friends of mine started talking to me about the sexual abuse they experienced as children. And I started to recognize that, in fact, this wasn't a victimless crime, that it was a form of men's violence against women. And so issues of commercial sexual exploitation, I understood a little bit later on. And it was very telling that I had this blind spot around prostitution. I saw that domestic violence was wrong. I saw sexual assault, sexual harassment. I could really understand kind of like the harm in those practices. But that breaking through this issue of men's entitlement, looking at prostitution specifically as a victimless crime, was something that took me a little longer. And it took me a little longer because it took until I met people who had survived prostitution, who I started talking to about their experiences. And when I started listening, what I heard was that people in prostitution generally enter when they're kids or teens, that they experience physical abuse, emotional abuse, neglect in the home. Home's not a safe place to be. So they run from home, or they're taken from home, or they spend a great deal of time away from home where they're vulnerable to abuse and manipulation by usually significantly older men who use physical, emotional, sexual abuse to gain power and maintain control over them and turn them out into systems of prostitution that I was starting to recognize were really similar to other forms of domestic and sexual violence. While they were in the life, they experienced harm that was off the charts, kidnapping, torture, murder rates. If they managed to get out the life, they got out with a lot of damage to themselves, many with criminal histories that prevented them from getting employment, not to mention the kind of psychological suffering that they continue to experience. And so this really got me focused in the early 90s on the issue of commercial sexual exploitation, and specifically on what men can do about it. And so what I'm here to talk with you today about is about the culmination of over 30 years of work on this issue, both with survivors of commercial sexual exploitation, adults as well as youth, as well as with buyers of commercial sexual exploitation. And so I want to share with you a bit about how I understand the issue and what that points to in terms of what we can do about it. Right? So when we're thinking about commercial sexual exploitation and prostitution, I want to recognize that the problem with prostitution is not that it involves sex. The primary problem is the harm experienced by people who are exploited. And I think that oftentimes we talk about the harm, and I did this for years as well. We talk about the most overt forms of harm. We talk about the murders and the brutal rapes and sexual assaults and the violence that people in the life experience. And while that is all true for most in the life, that those are things that they experience, we don't even need to go to that level of abuse if we're just looking at the psychological impact of being in prostitution, not necessarily having been trafficked by a third party, but just being in prostitution. The harm is significant. And I just want to take a look at that to kind of set the stage. What we know about people who have been in prostitution is that 98% who are presently in the life and 96% who have left the life report at least one psychological issue. Now, the most frequently reported issues include the following: depression, anxiety, nightmares, flashbacks, low self-esteem, shame or guilt, PTSD, suicide attempts. So this really paints a picture, I believe, for us about what the experience of being prostituted is like. And I think it's important to take a look at this in the context of our discussion today around demand or men's entitlement to pay for sex. Because I think that what often happens when people talk about demand is that they want to say, well, we need to deal with the issue of demand because it causes third-party exploitation and trafficking. And I think we need to take it a step further and take a look at men's entitlement to sex per se, full stop, and see that it's problematic. The great story about this is years ago, I met a man for coffee who wanted to self-refer to our sex buyers intervention program in Seattle. We would have court-mandated men. Every now and then somebody would call and say that they wanted to stop buying sex and wanted to come to the class. And so I met him for coffee. And the first thing he said when we sat down was, Peter, I just want to let you know, I'm a good John. And he continued and said, I've never hurt one of the girls physically, and I've never hurt them emotionally. And then he stopped himself, and he said, well, I'm not sure if I've ever hurt them emotionally or not, because when you're with them, it's like they have a mask on. You look in their eyes, and it's like they're not even there. My question to him pretty quickly was, what part about this other person being dissociative told you that it was a great time to go ahead and have sex with them? So here he was saying, I'm not physically abusive, I'm not one of the bad guys, yet this person, in order to do this act with him, had to psychologically take leave from the situation at hand. When I asked him further if when he was with women who weren't in prostitution and he saw them leave their body like that, if he would continue to have sex on him with them, he said no. And when I asked him why, he said, because I did not pay. And so I think that speaks to this issue of the acts of buying commercial sex as being one that's intrinsically problematic, right? And this fits in with the whole Me Too movement that we've been experiencing the past 3 years or so, or even more than that now. But if we look at Me Too, if I've learned anything over the past few years of Me Too, it's that sexual activity should not be a condition of employment. And if sexual activity should not be a condition of employment, then sexual activity should not be a condition of employment. If quid pro quo sexual harassment creates harm in the workplace, then prostitution creates harm in the world. And it's simply not okay to say, don't do this to that white professional woman in the workplace, but that youth with no options on the street, yeah, that's okay, do it to her, right? If inequality is created by sexual exploitation in the workplace, prostitution creates inequality in the world. And so I think we need to kind of go beyond this narrow definition of trafficking that was created by the TVPA. As happy as I am that we're talking about trafficking and there are more services and resources available for those that have been exploited, I think it's really important to look at sex buying, not as a problem because it causes third-party exploitation, pimping, and trafficking, but because it's a problem. And it's a problem definitely for the women who experience the harm of commercial sexual exploitation, but it's a problem for other people in the lives of men who buy sex. What we know is there's an evidence for connection between sexual aggression and prostitution, and that buying sex has been associated with men perpetrating other forms of gender-based violence, including physical and sexual abuse against intimate partners, perpetration of rape against both partners and non-partners, college-age men who used women in prostitution reported having committed more sexually coercive behaviors than men who had not. And cross-culturally, in samples of more than 1,000 men across several countries, men who had ever bought sex were more likely to perpetrate rape. And I think it's important to consider this because I think often people think about prostitution as this sort of cathartic mechanism that somehow we need this legitimate target over here for men to have sex with so that they won't sexually assault. And I think what we know is that is just false. That if somebody has this transactional way that they think about sex and these feelings of entitlement to sexual access to the bodies of other people, that it doesn't stop with people in prostitution. It extends to people in their relationships with and to women as a class. Something that people don't know and often find surprising is that most men who buy sex want to stop buying sex. So recently, probably the biggest survey to date in 2019 by Demand Abolition, looked at anonymous self-identified sex buyers and found that 64% of them either agreed or strongly agreed with the statement, "I would like to stop buying sex." And so it brings up the question, right? If most sex buyers want to stop buying sex, why are they buying sex in the first place? So that's our question, really. Why do men buy sex? And if we have a commitment to stop commercial sexual exploitation, this is the central thing that we need to have. We need to be able to unpack this question, and we need to be able to take a look at why it is that men feel entitled to pay for sex. And from the men themselves, I've got a couple quotes here from men that have been in the Stopping Sexual Exploitation class. That's Stopping Sexual Exploitation, SSE, is how we've abbreviated here, is the 10-week sex buyer intervention program that I founded in Seattle. And I had this participant at SSE, when I asked him why I bought sex, he said, "I buy sex because the only thing I'm more afraid of than intimacy is rejection." And I think that speaks volumes. You know, afraid of rejection, but pay and you can't be rejected. Afraid of intimacy, having to actually engage with this other person, right? Actually have the consequences of being in relation with another person and treating them like a human being. No, don't want that. And so that is, I think, true for so many men who buy sex. And I had another man who said it a different way, but said the same thing. He said, "I buy sex because I love sex, but I hate women." This was even a lot for me when I heard him say this. And after I picked my jaw up off the table, as I sat across from him, I asked him, "What do you mean you buy sex because you love sex, but you hate women?" And he went on to say, "Well, I hate women because I was married to one of them." Notice one of them. I was married to one of them for 15 years. And then she left me and took half of everything I had. And so I'm never going to trust another one of them again. And I'm just going to go ahead and pay for sex. We all pay somehow. I buy sex because I love sex, but I hate women. I buy sex because the only thing I'm more afraid of than intimacy is rejection. And you see how those things are the same. You know, over the course of our class with him, about week 5, this guy stayed after and came up to me and said, Peter, I just want you to let you know, I'm learning a lot about myself and I think I might start dating again. And I thought to myself, oh no, what have I done? If we're going to look at why men buy sex, I think that what we need to look at fundamentally is the social construction of gender, about what we learn about masculinity when we're growing up, and what we learn about women and femininity, and what we learn about sexual activity and sexuality. And so looking at and taking apart the social construction of gender is essential. And when I asked the men in the class that I've taught to sex buyers, at the end, what was most helpful, they talk about this exploration of the social construction of gender, or as we talk about it with them, the act like a man box. And I think that this messaging starts really early in life. Boys are taught from birth, that you need to act like a man, you need to be a man. And I'm not talking about healthy forms of masculinity here. What I'm talking about is this idea that men have to embody these hegemonic or toxic modes of masculinity, where we're always strong, we never show any emotions except for anger and pride, where we are great at sports and we always get the girl, where we're always ready for sex, where we have lots of sex and lots of sex partners. What that does, what all this messaging does, is it sets a standard for boys and men to live up to. But in reality, none of us can live up to that standard all the time. Right? But a lot of boys and men, most of us actually in our younger years, pretend that we do somehow. Pretend that somehow we meet that standard, because we know that if other men start to look at us as less than real men, meaning either gay or woman-like, that we're going to become targets like gay men and like women. Right? We're going to be seen as subordinate, like gay men and like women. And so this is really rooted in ideas about male supremacy. This is really rooted in ideas about women's subordinate status to men. Right? And sexual objectification, the dehumanization that goes on not just in intimate partner violence, but in sexual assault and sexual harassment, goes on in commercial sexual exploitation as well. In fact, it's fundamental to it. And I need to say here that this is not, when I say it's a form of gender-based violence, it's not saying that there aren't men or boys or trans people who are victims. Absolutely there are. There are occasionally women who buy sex. It's very rare, even rarer than women who commit domestic violence or sexual assault. But what it is to say is that the buyer is primarily male. It's about men's gendered sense of identity and the link between men's ideas about sex and dominance and power connected to their identity about or who they are in the world. Right? So this act like a man training is essential to understand if we're going to understand why men buy sex. And we talk about toxic masculinity. Actually, I was talking to somebody yesterday just about this, and he was a man who was saying I'm so sick of hearing about toxic masculinity. Men, not all men hurt women, and I had to say to him, well, yeah, but toxic masculinity actually hurts men first, right? That we experience kind of like having to embody this thing where we have to cut ourselves up in pieces, not be our full selves, and not be given the ability to deal with the social emotional skills to move through difficulties in our life. And so what happens to boys and men is we end up either shutting down and like taking it out on ourselves. Look at the suicide rates, the alcoholism rates among men, depression rates, covert depression rates among the men who even seek help, not to count the covert depression that's a state of being for so many men in the world, right? Or we shut it down and then amplify it and project it and take it out on other people and on women as a class, right? And so I think that Thoreau said it best, about the suffering that men experience because of men's toxic masculinity. Most men lead lives of quiet desperation and go to the grave with the song still in them. Right? This lack of inability to step into your full, authentic selfhood because you've been given this really limited notion of who you are and who you should be as a man in the world. that's being reinforced by your peers in the culture to be rooted in dominance rather than rooted in true equality and respect for the other. The challenge that I think we have is to model equality, is to inhabit as men the fullest sense of ourselves and be able to ally ourselves with those who have the least in the world. Bell Hooks also talked about sex buying in an incredible way. She said, most men think that sex will provide them with a sense of being alive, connected, that sex will offer closeness, intimacy, pleasure. And more often than not, sex simply does not deliver the goods. This fact does not lead men to cease obsessing about sex. It intensifies their lust and their longing. And I think here what Bell Hooks is saying to us is that when we think of sex as a transaction, that we're going to not, it's not going to have that intimacy, pleasure, and closeness that we're seeking. And when men pay for sex with an expectation that they're going to get closeness, intimacy, pleasure, it's just not going to work. You don't get here from here. But I think what happens is the culture tells men that we can get our relational needs met through non-relational sex. And that too is one of the things we need to understand if we understand why men buy sex. So we need to understand these ideas about masculinity. We also need to understand the way men are socialized to think about women and girls. And especially helpful, I think, is this idea of the good girl, bad girl dichotomy, that there are a category of women out there who are good girls and a category who are bad girls. These are the women that you marry. These are the women that you have sex with. These are the ones that you treat with respect. These are the ones that you don't. These are the ones that are in prostitution, right? The bad girl dichotomy, the bad girl category is the kind of archetype for the woman in prostitution. And this, is used, this good girl, bad girl dichotomy is a construct that's used to blame the victims of commercial sexual exploitation, blame people in prostitution for what happens to them. But it also is used to blame other women who experience other forms of gender-based violence for the harm that happens to them by putting them into this bad girl category. And this happens most evidently, I think, when we see sexual assault and we see the response to it, and we think of the victim-blaming questions that happen when we learn somebody's been sexually assaulted. And they are things like, what was she wearing? Was she drinking? Was she using drugs? What's her sexual history? What was she doing in that place alone? Why did she go with this guy? And the question is really, is she culpable? Does she fit into this bad girl category? Is she a slut? Because if she is, then she deserves it. She deserves what she got. And what that does is it distracts our attention from the person who had the power to actually decide whether this act was happening or not. And that is the person who bought sex, or the person who sexually assaulted or sexually harassed or was abusive to their intimate partner. And so these types of victim blaming are really essential to understand if we want to understand prostitution. Evelina Giobi was one of the first founders of the first organizations that were working with women in the United States in the 80s in Minneapolis from this perspective. And what she said was prostitution isn't like anything else. Rather, everything else is like prostitution because it's a model for women's condition. Or one of the men in my class a couple of years back said it the same way. Said it a different way, but meant the same thing. If you scratch the surface, they are all whores underneath. Right? Meaning, all women are whores. Meaning, and many of the buyers have said this to me. I'm sorry that I'm crass at times in these presentations, but I think it's important to fully understand kind of like what this mindset is about. If you scratch the surface, they are whores underneath. We all pay somehow. Whether you're paying by having to take her out to dinner, having to get married, having to treat her nice, having to talk to her, having to blah, 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 on and on and on and on. If you scratch the surface, they are all whores underneath, right? Which means they're culpable for their exploitation. Actually, they're probably freaky and like it that way in the mindset of the buyer of commercial sex. So I'm entitled to act out because this is part of the nature of her being. And it's part of the nature of all women's being. right? So you can see how this is linked to all forms of gender-based violence and doesn't stop just at people who have been commercially sexually exploited, and definitely not just at people who are sex trafficked. And I think a thing to understand is it's not just a few bad apples. It's not just the men who buy sex that are responsible for this cultural and social norm around men's entitlement to pay for sex. There's been interesting research that shows that although most men don't buy sex, many say that it's okay for men that do. And I think that we need to take a look at how this fits in with the culture more broadly, and with gender-based violence more broadly, and with issues of equality more broadly, because it's not just a few bad apples. You know? And this speaks to the norms around buying sex. When the guys come into the class, they say things like this man did. I always thought that buying sex was just normal for men, that it was just something that we did sometimes. I didn't really think about it. I didn't care about the women. For him, even though most men don't buy sex, this was normal. And this brings us to this idea about toxic or hegemonic masculinity. You know, most men don't embody this form of masculinity. It's not assumed to be normal in a statistical sense, but it is normative in that it embodies the currently most honored way of being a man and requires all other men to position themselves in relation to it. And it ideologically legitimates the subordination of women to men. That is dense. And so I just want to tell a quick story to kind of take it apart for you. And here's something that happened. In one of my cohorts of the SSE class, we were talking about marital rape. And I was explaining to the men that up until a few decades ago, there were over half the states in the United States where there was a marital rape exemption, where a man could not be charged with raping his wife. One of the guys hears this and looks up and says, "Yeah, I call them the good old days." All right. So the biggest jerk in the room kind of has stepped forward and thrown down the gauntlet. And so what we see here is how hegemonic or toxic masculinity sets norms within a male group. Because although all these men don't agree with it, what do you think they do? They just get really silent. Some of them laugh along with him, ha ha ha. Some of them look at me expecting that I'm going to interrupt this. Some of them look at other people. And I waited and waited and waited for one of them to interrupt, and eventually had to break in and say, really, do all of you think that it's okay to rape your wife? You know, and eventually one of them came forward and said, no, I don't think it's okay to rape your wife. Thank you, congratulations, here's a cookie. And after class, there were a couple other guys hanging out waiting to come talk to me and say, you know what, I just want to let you know I didn't agree with that guy. That guy was the biggest jerk in the room. The other men didn't agree to him, but he sets the norm, and that's the way the biggest jerk in the room sets the norm. It embodies the currently most honored way of being a man, or most feared way. It requires men to position themselves in relation to it, and ideologically legitimates the subordination of women to men, in that it throws women under the bus so that men can have this protection from other men's violence. It brings us to the issue of male bonding. And when I talk about this, I'm not talking about going fishing with your male friends and talking about your lives. And I mean, I love my male friends. I love spending time with them. I love the way that I get support and can share stuff with them. And they're essential to my being. But what I'm talking about is toxic ways of male-male bonding. And these social bonds have a powerful influence on the sexual relations of heterosexual men. Men's world, homosociality, shapes the sexual relations in which these men engage, the meanings given to their sexual involvements, and the way that we develop narratives about them. And that all-male peer group, the homosociality, organizes men's socio-sexual relations in at least 4 ways. There is that male friendships take priority over male-female relations. In the vernacular, we say bros before hoes, right? And it's no accident, again, that has to do with prostitution. It's the model for women's condition. It's the model for commercial sexual exploitation, and the model for gender-based violence. Number 2, platonic friendships with women are dangerously feminizing. That is a barrier to equality when we think about we cannot have friendships with women. Heterosexual itself, like sex itself, can be the medium through which male bonding is enacted, right? And this could be a gang rape. This could be a situation like that. I would equally extend it to the purchase of commercial sex, where men as a class are sharing this particular class of women. And number 4, men's sexual storytelling is shaped by homosocial masculine cultures and creates these norms about sex and sexuality. Right? And so this brings us to, what do we do about it? Here's this problem. Now, I know most of you are aware of what Sweden did about it, and Sweden developed this way of dealing with sexual exploitation called the equality model, or the Nordic model. And this Nordic model basically criminalized the buying of sex, decriminalized the selling of sex, and kept criminal pimping and trafficking. And it also created a robust community education to address the social norms at the root of the practice, but it was rooted in equality values. And I think that's key to understand. So when I was in Seattle about 10 years ago, what we tried to do was bring people together and figure out, how do we do the equality model on the ground in Seattle? And here we go. This is when I was speaking about the program we developed at the Carter Center a few years ago. I was on a panel with countries that had introduced the equality model. So Ireland came and said, you know, we've done doing the equality model. We passed it legislatively. We haven't yet figured out how to do it on the ground. France said the same thing. And then when it was my turn, I said, well, you know, in King County in Washington State, we do not have the Nordic model yet, but we're figuring out how to operationalize it, how to implement it on the ground. And so what we were doing when we were doing this was breaking it down into these programs specifically for exploited persons, where we engaged them in prevention, survivor-led exit programming, safe access to resources and support, and real alternatives to commercial sexual exploitation. It's aspirational, obviously. It's not all in place. For exploiters, buyers, as well as traffickers, buying is a form of exploitation. We needed to do prevention, disruption, intervention, accountability, and transformation. And then we needed to work on the community education piece, the social norms, where we did prevention and changed the norms that blame people who are exploited and promote the systematic exploitation of others. So we developed this Ending Exploitation Collaborative, and you've got the website there. Check it out about how this plays out on the ground. And these are some of the organizations in Seattle that presently are working to scale and replicate the work that we've done in Seattle with the rest of Washington State. I have left and live on the East Coast now, and with Modeling Equality, I'm trying to bring this model to others. And what this model includes is some direct interventions, right, with commercial sex buyers across the spectrum of prevention and intervention. Not just working with buyers once they've bought, but looking at parenting boys, teaching empathy and respect to children, doing middle school and high school prevention curricula, awareness work promoting men's accountability, online deterrence. Some great technology work is happening right now across the country, doing outreach to buyers, doing interruption with buyers when they're in the process of trying to buy sex through chatbot technology, doing arrests, which are important, the prosecution and conviction of buyers, and the post-conviction intervention program. And if we looked at the resources that we devoted to these things, it should look kind of like an inverted triangle. And while I am a big proponent of intervention courses, especially longer term ones, we need to get as far upstream as we can to change the culture if we want to change the lives of these individual men and impact their decisions to pay for sex. But again, it's not just a few bad apples. So we don't need to just look at interventions with individuals. We need to look at these systems, right? Because while commercial sex buying is an individual behavioral problem, it's also a social problem. It's also rooted in societal norms around gender inequality. And so we need to figure out how together we can change society. And that seems like a heavy lift, right? It's hard enough to change yourself without thinking about changing society. But we've got some tools that I think, in this map that I think we developed in King County that was really helpful in helping us target our interventions, because people don't just exist within society broadly. We exist in relationships. And these socially ecological models bridge the gap between behavioral theories that focus only on individuals and theories that focus on social and cultural norms change, right? So we recognize that people are in relationships, that we have other circles of community around us. Notice I've got 5 minutes left, and that is awesome, Julie, because I'm right on target. In addition to the communities that we're in, we're part of institutions, and those are in turn part of society, right? And so I think that this social ecological model is, the buyer is there in the middle, and we can think about changing that buyer in the middle. Or we can think about changing the world around him, because that impacts the choices that he makes. Changing the people he's in relationship with, changing the communities around him, the institutional norms and the society through legislation, through policies and practices at institutions, through the norms in workplaces. All of these things contribute to this culture where sex buying happens. I introduced this concept to the sex buyers that come through the SSE class, and we do it on the final night of the program. And we do it because I know that I'm not going to see some of them again ever. And while what I want from them is that they never buy sex again, what I want even more from them is that they help co-create a culture where sex buying doesn't happen. Because we have really limited capacity to put people through a post-conviction sex buyers intervention program. In Seattle, we're doing it more than anybody else, I think, around the country right now. But what we know is that it's a real fraction of the men that pay for sex. Most men never get caught for buying sex. Most men won't have access to a program like this. And so what we need to do is to have these men to be able to go out and leverage their relationships and their communities and institutions and society. So I use this map as a teaching tool for them. And I say, okay, think about who you're in relationships with. Think about what you can do to them, with them to end commercial sexual exploitation. And they often talk about the boys that they're parenting. They often talk about their friends that they talk to and how they're going to have the courage to speak up and interrupt oppressive language when they hear it, when they hear sexism, when they hear talk about prostitution that they don't agree with. They are going to engage their communities. I was invited by many of the buyers that came to the class into their communities, their faith-based communities, their workplaces, some of which were healthcare settings, in order to do training around commercial sexual exploitation, right? They also were asked to think about institutions and laws and how we can impact this. And so it's a powerful tool, I think, to figure out how you as a community can come together to address this. One thing that helps further in addressing this is break it down into sectors, right? That it's not just about kind of society as a whole and broken out into the social ecological framework, but we can think of how each of these sectors kind of, thank you, how each of these sectors can address things. Definitely the criminal justice sector and the government sector have a role to play in stopping things, but we can't expect that the criminal legal system alone is going to solve this problem. We need to expand. We need to do work in the health sector, the business sector, education, technology, with other community partners, including community-based organizations, neighborhood associations, just basically anybody who will listen to get in there and figure out what we can do to end commercial sexual exploitation and gender-based violence. And when I'm saying this, I'm not saying how to just end or identify victims, right? Because you could go to any healthcare facility right now and there's some training that they've done around identification of trafficking victims. Well, that's all well and good, but I used to have nurses and physicians coming through my sex buyers program who had been through those trainings about how to identify the victims. What we need to do is understand as communities and understand as a society, a global society, how sex buying is rooted in systems of inequality and how we need to transform culture in order to bring this and all forms of inequality to a stop. How we can have the courage to step into identities based on support and mutuality rather than dominance and exploitation. And I'd like to end now with a quote from Bertolt Brecht, who's a great playwright, and he wrote, because I think this gets overwhelming sometimes when we're working in these sorts of spaces and we're dealing with all of this trauma and all of this abuse, and when it seems hopeless, is to recognize this, that in the dark times will there also be singing. Yes, there will be singing about the dark times. And so we need to go into those spaces, and we need to be able to be our authentic selves, not shut down because of fear, not shut down because we're afraid, but to step in and to be able to sing truth to power and to be able to transform the world any way we can by leveraging all of the people in our community and co-creating a culture that is really worth having. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That was amazing. And I think that is just what we needed to hear. When we started to talk with you about being with us today, I was like, oh gosh, only 45 minutes. What can we cover in 45 minutes? Because I feel like this needs to be like weeks and months and like just more and more conversations. But thank you for coming and being with us.
I will give a quick, yeah, and contact me. All of you folks who are out there, I don't, if you have ideas, if you have more questions, I have funding for a couple more years to actually do this work of kind of they give technical assistance and training to communities across the country in terms of developing this model where you are. So if you're interested in any aspect of this, the Sex Buyers Intervention Program, prevention work, anything else, and definitely reach out and I'll get back to you and we'll figure out a time where we can talk about it.
I sure hope that you did enjoy that presentation. I know it's a new conversation. It's one that gets me really excited. And I'm really pleased to have Peter back with us live for some Q&A time. Jane, do you have our questions for us?
Absolutely. Peter, thank you so much. That was quite an eye-opening and amazing presentation. I just had a really quick observation. It seems that many of the same reasons that men give for buying sex are also some of the reasons they give for using pornography. Afraid of rejection, afraid of intimacy, always ready for sex. It seems like that those could be interchangeable. So here is a question that came in. So based on your comments on the Nordic model, are you saying that you support prostitution in the US?
No, absolutely not. I think that sex buying is inherently exploitative and should be criminalized. But what I also think is that criminalization of people in prostitution becomes a barrier for them to be able to get the healing that they need. And it's a way that looks at them and tells them that they've done something wrong rather than something's been wrong to them. So I think in terms of the Nordic model, what the beauty of the Nordic model was it decriminalized the seller of commercial sex while criminalizing the buyer and the trafficker. So it's that asymmetrical approach that I think is the most appropriate in dealing with issues of prostitution.
Okay, thanks for answering that question.
Sure.
Here is a second question, pardon me. How do we as a society combat toxic masculinity?
Well, I think that we, that we need to work along a spectrum of prevention, and we need to, starting when we are parenting kids, right on through middle school or elementary school programs around social emotional learning and development, through middle school and high school prevention programs on dating violence, sexual assault, other forms of gender-based violence and inequality. So I think that it has to happen all along kind of the lifespan. And I think that it needs to be something that we're engaged in with across sectors, right? That it's not something that just the criminal justice system or just the criminal legal system even can address. That we need to be working kind of in businesses to adopt policies and practices that support equality. And we need to work with the health sector And we need to work in education, not just to do prevention programming that's targeting the kids, but to actually change the institutional norms. I did, for many years, I did prevention work in middle schools and high schools, and you're there for the kids, but then after class lets out, you see that they're using sexist language in the hallways, and the teachers are standing by not doing anything about it, right? So maybe we need to work with the teachers as well and other staff members in order to help change the institutions around the people who we want to impact. So it's broad, it's across sectors, and it's across the spectrum of prevention.
So just to kind of segue a little bit off of what you just said, we had a question in regards to the curriculum. So what does that middle school and high school curriculum look like? And I know that's a pretty broad question, but if you could even just touch on some of the highlights that you think need to be included, and maybe even include the curriculum for the teachers and not just
well, I think that the place where most trafficking prevention programs fall short, or many, they're getting better and better, is that they go in and focus just on the potentially trafficked person and say, this is how to prevent yourself from being trafficked. And for me, having started my work in sexual assault prevention, it reminds me of what we used to do back in the 70s and 80s, which at that point, rape prevention was about giving out whistles to the girls in the class and saying, here, if you're going to get raped, blow this whistle, right? And around the late 80s, early 90s, we started to see, hey, while we're in this class, we have the boys here, we can potentially talk to them about consent, about mutuality, about healthy relationships, and we can kind of engage in this more holistic model of prevention. And so I think that we need to learn those lessons in the anti-trafficking prevention work that's going on now, and be there not just to talk about preventing people from being trafficked, but in fact, prevent men from buying sex. When we're talking with teenage boys, we know most men buy sex in their early 20s for the first time. So this is a great time to get in there and to have those conversations with them. I think at best, it's integrated into existing curricula that are already available in many locations around dating violence and sexual assault, because all of these issues are linked. So yeah, in a nutshell, that's it. And feel free to reach out and contact me if anybody out there has interest in talking more about this.
Great, thank you. Thank you for that answer. Another question is, while in Seattle, did those who completed the Stopping Sexual Exploitation program, did they have their cases dismissed?
So what was important for us was to have it as a condition of their sentencing, right? So no, they did not. It was just a condition for them. They had to pay a fine. They had to do whatever else they had to do, and in addition to everything else, they had to come through the class. And I think that's important. The arguments can be made for diversion programs, and that's something that people need to decide community by community, municipality by municipality. But I think that something we need to do is to set a norm around sex buying that says it's not okay. And I think the more consequences that we have around it, the more serious it shows that we're taking it. And so those consequences set a norm that tells us that this behavior is not one, it's okay. And so I support, post-conviction programs.
Great, okay. I'm gonna check the chat, see if we have any additional questions before we wrap it up. And so here's a question that entered the chat. What kind of changes in the entertainment industry would you like to see? Movies, music, etc.
I would love to see a lot more movies and entertainment that are pro-social and that have some really positive messages and examples of mutuality and examples of awesome, consensual, wonderful relationships that are based on equality. I would like to see more of that and less of this kind of eroticization of inequality, because I think that that's where a lot of these, it reinforces a lot of the norms that are existing around the sexualization of inequality. of others. You know, so I think that more pro-social kind of messaging is out there, the better.
Excellent. Okay. So we are coming up on just about a minute before we are to end, and we want to respect everybody's time. So Julie, I'll turn it back to you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Peter, for being with us today. And I do want to let everybody know that Peter has offered to continue to engage with us. And we are really hoping to get some good conversations started. So thanks for spending a portion of your morning with us, Peter. Like Jane said, we have come to the end of our time together. Thank you for sticking with us through some tech issues earlier. I lost internet and we had some other issues with some of our team. But in saying that, I want to say a huge thank you. There are a team of us scattered throughout the city this morning who have been working to get this pulled off. So to Isaiah Seaborn and Joey Neff, I say thank you for running all the tech for us. And thank you for those who are participating for putting up with those little bloopers and issues that we had earlier. I do want you to know that these presentations will be available after this event ends. The presentation by Jessa Crisp will only be available until the 21st. So if you're wanting to rewatch, please do that before this coming Wednesday. I hope that you have been challenged by the information that has been shared today. In order for true breakaway from human trafficking to happen, we need to be properly informed so that we can effectively engage in our community on multiple levels. Some of us should be actively engaged in prevention efforts through presentations, awareness, and educating people on the realities and dangers of this crime. Some of us will have the opportunity to directly support a survivor or an organization that supports survivors. And we should be actively learning and gaining more tools so that we can be effective in helping on the long term. Some of us need to join the conversation that we are starting today about engaging sex buyers. What can our community do about this issue? What can you do about this issue? We need for you to join the conversation. Men out there, we need you to join this conversation. If we want to put a dent in the demand for purchased sex, we must address the individuals who are out there and actively seeking to purchase sex. And larger than that, we must begin to address the societal issues that allow the exploitation of people to happen. Like Peter mentioned, that starts when our children are young. If we're going to change society, we've got to start engaging at that level, at that age. I hope that many of you are ready for this challenge. Let's get the conversation started and see where it goes. We need everyone, citizens, organizations, lawmakers, district attorneys, county commissioners, the list goes on. We need everyone. Affecting and implementing change takes all of us, and our challenge to you today is to get involved. There'll be a survey coming your way after this event. Please take time to fill that out. Give us some feedback for the future. Thank you again for spending your time with us this morning. I know it was a lot of information in a short amount of time, so thank you for hanging with us. We'll spend about the next 5 or 10 minutes. Our PowerPoint and videos will play one more time. Continue to get in touch with each other through chat. Make sure that you grab each other's email addresses so that you can connect after this event has ended. Thank you again for joining us for the 13th Annual Human Trafficking Symposium.
Hi, this is Jenny Hansen with SOCSAM. I wanted to share with you briefly our journey. In 2002, while I was visiting an orphanage in Phnom Penh, Cambodia, I heard a child say, "If my mom had a job, I would not live here." If my mom had a job, she would not be a prostitute. No child should live this reality. I started with job creation in 2002 after hearing this cry. In 2005, I began to see the roots of human trafficking, and I wanted to do something to help. I wanted to dig deeper. SOCSAM started with one mom, one bag, and one machine. We created a nurturing, empowering, restorative program that has helped to heal hundreds of lives. This is how the battle of human trafficking is won, one person, one family, one community at a time. The last 15 years of our journey was one of rescue, restoration, rehabilitation, and reintegration. We worked with the girls wholly, mind, body, soul, spirit, socially, vocationally, financially, spiritually, every which way. Our previous victims are now the leaders, running prevention programs, creating fair, sustainable, empowering jobs to both men and women in economically depressed areas where human trafficking is rampant. Your purchase of Saxon products helps to change lives directly.
Hi, I'm Tiffany. And I'm Robin, and we are the case managers for the Human Trafficking Department at TESSA of Colorado Springs. TESSA is an organization that has been around for over 40 years, and we traditionally have served survivors and victims of domestic violence and sexual assault, and we are adding our human trafficking program, which officially rolls out January 2021. However, we already have served 32 clients of human trafficking this year. We operate from a place of trauma-informed care, and all of our services are client-led. We work with many partner organizations in the area, including the 4th Judicial District, the District Attorney's Office, Peak Vista, Veterans Health and Trauma Clinic, UC Health Memorial, the Forensic Nurse Examiner's Team, Homeward Pikes Peak, the Harbor Clinic, Lutheran Family Services, the El Paso County Sheriff's Office, Pikes Peak Workforce, the El Paso County Department of Human Services, and the Colorado Springs Police Department. Thank you so much for your time today.